Hello there, little masters, and welcome back. Welcome back to Bree and to the Prancing Pony Podcast. Step on up to the bar, mind the crowds. Tonight, the good stuff might just make you late for dinner.
I can't think what anybody sees in that good stuff. West Uhal, my friends. I'm Shawn Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark, and I'm here with the man of the West, the Nori to my Dory, Alan Sisto.
Oh, thank you, Shawn. Well, folks, hopefully you caught our special episode on Thursday for the 80th anniversary of The Hobbit. That was the final episode of Season 1 of the Prancing Pony Podcast. And it was really a fantastic discussion with Corey Olsen, the Tolkien professor himself. So if you haven't listened to that, please do. And if you did, you'll know that in today's episode, as we start Season 2, we finally start The Hobbit.
Yay!
But we're not going to start on the narrative just yet, are we?
No, we're not.
Boo.
Boo. We're not going to start reading tonight because we want to give a little introduction to The Hobbit, a look back at its history, its composition. Let's start that over. Its composition, its publication, its legacy, and hopefully a little time to talk about what it's meant to us. Those of you who have followed our last few episodes on the Silmarillion know that for all the major stories of Tolkien's legendarium, we really like to take a little time to set each one in context, give a little bit of that history. And I think for The Hobbit, obviously, we've got a lot to talk about, and I think we definitely have enough to fill an entire episode here tonight.
Yeah, I think we do.
Yeah.
And so we'll spend our time in this episode doing exactly that, and that will send us off in style so that we can really get into the story next time. We promise. We promise we will start reading the story in our next episode.
We do promise.
Beginning, of course, with the very famous first sentence, sentence upon which I have called dibs.
Yeah, I have given it willingly.
You know what? It's part of the Arendelle deal.
That's right.
It was.
Yeah.
It was Arendelle for opening line of The Hobbit and a second-round draft pick.
That's right.
And cash considerations. But before we
Wait, I don't remember that one.
20% of your earnings from this show.
Oh, that'll
Let me
be
see.
That'll be easy.
Times zero, carry the zero.
Carry the zero and divide by zero.
There's your Firefly reference for the night, folks.
Yeah,
we already have digressed, and it's only 2.5 minutes in. So before we dig in, I think it's time for a Tolkien Fun Fact.
Yay! It's been a while since we've done one of these.
Far too long.
Far too long indeed. We are going to try to do a better job of including this segment more often because we actually do have a lot of good ones lined up for you.
We really do. And you know what? We're actually, spoilers, we're actually looking at possibly introducing a couple of new segments too.
Maybe so.
That's what Season 2 is all about,
Stay
folks.
tuned for that. Season 2. Onward and upward. But tonight's fun fact, to get us back into the swing here, comes to us from Humphrey Carpenter's J.R.R. Tolkien, a biography. Of course, this is one of our favorite sources here.
It is.
Now, of course, we all know that our dear Professor Tolkien was English, seemingly as English as they come, right? From Birmingham and the West Midlands, and probably English enough to call it Birmingham.
Oh, yes.
Unlike myself. Obsessed with the language and culture of that part of England. But as a few of our listeners probably know, his surname was actually German.
Yeah. Yeah, this is true.
Humphrey Carpenter tells the story of how Tolkien's Aunt Grace explained the family name to him. And I'm going to go ahead and read a little bit from Carpenter right now.
Please do.
She alleged that the family name had originally been von Hohenzollern, for they had emanated from the Hohenzollern district of the Holy Roman Empire. A certain George von Hohenzollern had, she said, fought on the side of Archduke Ferdinand of Austria at the siege of Vienna in 1529.
Wow.
He had shown great daring in leading an unofficial raid against the Turks and capturing the Sultan's standard. This, said Aunt Grace, was why he was given the nickname Tolkien, foolhardy, and the name stuck.
Yes,
the family was also supposed to have connections with France and to have intermarried with the nobility in that country, where they acquired a French version of their nickname, Du Téméraire. Opinion differed among the Tolkiens.
Can you do that again? I like hearing you speak in French.
Du Téméraire.
Oh, the trill. That was very...
merci.
Well done.
4 years of high school French. That's what that does for you. Opinion differed among the Tolkiens as to why and when.
That's all it does for you.
I can order cheese like you have no idea.
Just don't try ordering ice water. They don't have it and they won't bring it to you.
No.
That's what I hear.
You can get I think you can order still water or sparkling water.
Fuzzy water? Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, there we go again.
I know. My apologies,
Anyway,
folks.
picking up at Du Téméraire.
Yeah.
Opinion different among the Tolkiens as to why and when their ancestors had come to England. The more prosaic said it was in 1756 to escape the Prussian invasion of Saxony, where they had lands. Aunt Grace preferred the more romantic, if implausible, story of how one of the Du Téméraires had fled across the Channel in 1794 to escape the guillotine, apparently then assuming a form of the old name, Tolkien.
My goodness.
Isn't that cool?
Well, you know, that is really cool.
Even if it's not entirely true, it's a great story.
It may be exaggerated or made out of whole cloth. It doesn't matter. It's a pretty cool story.
It's a great story.
And the first thing that strikes me about this is this foolhardy ancestor of Tolkien's reminds me a little bit of Bandobras Took.
Yeah.
I can't help but wonder if Tolkien's inserted a bit of himself into Bilbo's family history, as I know we would say that he inserted quite a bit of his own personality into Bilbo.
You know, I've had similar thoughts along those lines. I actually have even wondered, I've gone so far with that, and this is just total speculation.
We don't do that here.
No, never, never, ever. I've even wondered if the family name Took itself was inspired by the name Tolkien. Remember the old thing that Gandalf used to say to Pippin, fool of a Took.
That's true.
I almost dare say that, Took could be a shortened form of Tolkien, almost in the same way that maybe Hobbit is said to have been derived from the Old English Hobbitla. Really,
wow,
almost the same thing. You drop an L, you drop a last syllable, and you can get Took from Tolkien. That is total speculation. I am basing that on nothing, but it's a crazy thought I had once.
Nothing but your wild desires for that to be true.
I really do want it to be true. It is true.
It's pretty cool.
And if anybody knows for a fact that it's not true, please tell me. But
or don't.
But I like
don't
it.
Tell me, please.
I like it. The other thing I'm reminded of, and I kind of wanted to bring this in back when we talked about the story of Turin, but we didn't have time because we spent so much time on
That's what it was when you mentioned Captain Foolhardy, huh?
Yep. There's that moment in the Silmarillion when Glaurung calls Turin Captain Foolhardy. And I thought immediately of this Tolkien ancestor. Now, fortunately,
I'd forgotten all about it, so I was sitting there like a complete idiot, going, "What are you hinting at, Shawn? What?"
I know
I
was all mysterious. It worked very well.
Yes, you were.
But that's what I was thinking about here. Now, fortunately, the professor's mysterious ancestor wasn't doomed like the son of Hurin was.
Well,
but,
thankfully.
And I guess I'm glad he got married and fathered a child, which is not something I would say about the son of Hurin.
Yeah.
Sorry, was that too soon? Maybe that was too soon.
No, it's not too soon. It's never too soon. The Stone of the Hapless is still around, so it's okay. We can.
That is very true.
But I have a question. Did George von Hohenzollern? Oh, I think I might have gotten that. That's what 2 years of German in high school.
Sounds good to me. Yeah.
Did he knock the Sultan's head clean off with a club, only to have it sail 100 yards through the air and go straight down a rabbit hole? Now, I doubt that.
And invented Das Golf.
Das Golf at the same time. The Volkswagen Golf.
Ooh.
Well,
maybe
with that terrible pun.
Oh, man.
Let's get on with The Hobbit. Now,
let's do it.
One last thing before we start proper. We're going to be referencing several sources throughout the episode, and these are all resources that would be a great add to your Tolkien shelf. Of course, we have links available on our library page for you, but here's a list of what we're using, and these are sources that we're going to use to help us as we work our way through The Hobbit. So for the next, I don't know how many episodes. I don't want to say a chapter an episode or, 2 episodes per chapter, probably somewhere in between. I'd guess that we're probably going to have 30 or 35 episodes going through The Hobbit. But here are the sources.
That's probably about right.
Yeah. We've got The History of the Hobbit by John Ratliff, The Annotated Hobbit, annotations by Douglas Anderson, The J.R.R. Tolkien Reader's Guide by Christina Skull and Wayne Hammond, Exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit by Corey Olsen, which we talked about at length last episode, just a whopping, 3 days ago.
Yep.
And 2 other works that we've referenced before, both by Humphrey Carpenter, the biography of Tolkien and then the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, which he edited. So we do all the reading so you don't have to, but you should.
You definitely should. And hopefully we've really convinced you by now to go pick up Corey Olsen's book, Exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit.
Awesome book.
It's a great book. It's a super easy read.
And it's a perfect companion. You read a chapter in The Hobbit and then you read a chapter in his book.
And then you can go back and read a chapter of
Olsen.
Yeah. The others are, there's a lot there in some of the other ones. But
and some of them are a little harder to get through. I'll be honest.
Yeah, they are.
They're great sources, but they're not as easy to read. I think Olsen did a really good job creating
really
a good
making
balance
it
there.
digestible and really
Very
really
accessible.
focusing on the text and really
Yes.
making the text more accessible as opposed
Absolutely.
to going deep into the history of the text and all the changes to the text and, things like that. Like some of these
which
other
is fascinating in its own right. But I agree that
I
if-
think
if
they're
you only
all
could pick
good
up one-
companions to each other. Definitely.
I don't know. It's hard to say if you could only pick up one. I would say if you could only pick up one, I'd almost want to say the Annotated Hobbit, but I don't know. Olson's book would probably be the other one.
The Annotated Hobbit is a good one because from what I understand, that is the most accurate text of the Hobbit that is out there in any edition. And the annotations are really easy.
yeah.
They're right there in the columns right next to it.
Exactly. You don't have to look stuff up. It's all in the same book.
It does a lot more it gives a lot more insight into what happened after the book was published.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does.
As
It does a
opposed
good
to,
job.
sort of the development of it, which would be,
which
I
is
guess,
more
Ratliff's
Ratliff's focus.
Yeah. But anyway, we digress. You'll get a
We
sense of kind of what comes from each of these books as we
That's
as we
true.
talk through
You really
tonight,
will. Just tonight, you'll get
you'll get a
good
sense
feel
of
for
the angle of each one.
Absolutely. Well, I think we should start with the most famous account of the origin of the most famous first line in possibly all of literature. Shawn, you have a passage from Carpenter's biography on this, don't you?
I do. I do. The composition of the first line of The Hobbit is just one of my favorite stories, as I hope to spend a little time on later today. But but this version of the story comes from the very end of the chapter "The Storyteller" in Part 4 of Carpenter's biography. And I apologize, I'm going right back to a nice long quote from Carpenter.
Never a bad thing.
So this is from the very end of that chapter. He says, "So it was that during the 1920s and 30s, Tolkien's imagination was running along two distinct courses that did not meet. On one side were the stories composed for mere amusement, often specifically for the entertainment of his children. On the other were the grander themes, sometimes Arthurian or Celtic, but usually associated with his own legends. Meanwhile, nothing was reaching print, beyond a few poems in the Oxford magazine, which indicated to his colleagues that Tolkien was amused by dragons' hordes and funny little men with names like Tom Bombadil. A harmless pastime, they felt, if a little childish. Something was lacking, something that would bind the two sides of his imagination together and produce a story that was at once heroic and mythical, and at the same time tuned to the popular imagination. He was not aware of this lack, of course, nor did it seem particularly significant to him when suddenly the missing piece fell into place. It was on a summer's day, and he was sitting by the window in the study at Northmoor Road, laboriously marking school certificate exam papers. Years later, he recalled, one of the candidates had mercifully left one of the pages with no writing on it, which is the best thing that can possibly happen to an examiner, and I wrote on it, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit.
Oh.
Names always generate a story in my mind. Eventually, I thought I'd better find out what hobbits were like, but that's only the beginning."
Oh boy, is that an understatement. That's only the beginning. That's the beginning of so much.
The beginning.
Wow.
I have always loved that story. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more
isn't it?
about that later on. I always thought that was so cool. That's where the story came from, just from this one line.
Yeah.
I think, by now we've spent enough time looking at the history of Tolkien's writing that, some things about this really should not surprise us. Things like the fact that Tolkien has to discover what it means. He has to find out what hobbits were like.
I have to make up what hobbits are like. I have to find out. Like, they really are. And they're really like a particular thing.
And I need to find out what they are.
And I need to find it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That
takes me right back to things like, even the Eärendil story, I'll have to find out who he is, things like that.
Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, we don't know exactly when he wrote it, right?
No.
Or how long afterwards it was that he decided to turn it into a story. I think there are a few different versions of, how long it took between, the writing of this serendipitous inspired first line and when he actually turned it into
I wonder, did he tear that page out or did he leave it in the exam paper?
I have always wondered that.
And if that was your exam paper, please tell me you held on to it.
I would love to know if that exam paper is out there somewhere. And if some student got this back and probably was very angry at all the red marks and probably threw it right away. But
and didn't even look to the back and
having
saw
no idea
hole in the ground
how historical it would be. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I love this. I mean, it's just a wonderful story, and it shows that for Tolkien, these stories often just came to him in such a spectacular way, sometimes fully formed. In this case, not. He'd had no idea what a hobbit was. But he had the word, and for him, words meant so much that here he's got this starting point, this magnificent starting point.
Yeah.
But
flash of inspiration. I mean, that's a word, that's a phrase people, bandy about a lot. But I mean, in this case, it
doesn't
really
apply
seems
very
to be
often,
true.
but it does here.
It really does, yeah.
In terms of the chronology, even he seemed a little confused about it. There's a bunch of different, he says some different things depending on who he was talking to and when. In a 1957 interview, he said that it was only some months later when he thought that the opening words of The Hobbit were too good to leave just on the back of an examination paper.
Yeah.
I wrote the first chapter first, and then I forgot about it. Then I wrote another part. I myself can still see the gaps. There's a very big gap after they reach the eyrie of the eagles. After that, I really didn't know how to go on.
That's right, yeah. And I think Ratliff identified some of that too, and as he was sort of figuring out where the major gaps were in the composition of the story. So that was the 1957 interview, right?
Yeah.
So it was some months later. I know there's another interview out there, right?
Yep.
There's one I think in 1967 where he said that it was years before the story grew, right?
Yep.
And then there's another one that I've got here that was from 1966 where he said that he wrote the first line and then he said, I had no idea what a hobbit was, or perhaps I did sense it was a little creature of some sort, but I had never heard the word and had never used it. Then I decided, here is the beginning of a good book for my children, and I began to write. So that one makes it sound like he started writing immediately.
Yeah. Man, that's... Well,
I know.
As we know, depending on when he was asked, his recollections of things, were not always entirely complete. I'm not going to say they were inaccurate. They just weren't complete.
These are media interviews 20 and 30 and probably close to 40 years. 1967 would have been nearly 40 years
Almost
after
40 years after he
writing
started to write it. Yeah. That's a long time.
Yeah.
I'm lucky if I can remember what happened a week ago Tuesday.
Yeah.
So, granted, Tolkien, has forgotten more than I ever learned, but,
For sure,
it's pretty easy to understand why somebody couldn't quite remember the exact timeline of something that happened 40 years ago. But however long it took him, we know that he did read it to his kids while it was in development. I mean, that's the famous thing. We know that he read this to his kids, right? We hear this all the time. Mm-hmm. He said this himself several times. But really what's cool is there are a bunch of recollections from the Tolkien children themselves about him reading parts of the story to them at these winter reads.
Right.
And the best one of these has got to be from Christopher. It's a long one, but it is so worth it. I absolutely love this story. So I'm going to read this. So Christopher says, my father would stand with his back to the fire in his small study of the house in North Oxford, 22 Northmoor Road, and tell stories to my brothers and me. And Michael, that's his older brother, said that he remembered with perfect clarity the occasion when my father said that he was going to start telling us a long story about a small being with furry feet and asked us what he should be called, and then answering himself, saying, I think we'll call him a hobbit. Since my family moved from that house at the beginning of 1930, and since my brother preserved stories of his own in imitation of The Hobbit, which he dated 1929, he was convinced that The Hobbit began, at any rate, no later than that year. His opinion was that my father had written the opening sentence in the summer before he began telling us the story, and that he repeated those opening words as if he had invented them on the spur of the moment. He also remembered that I, then between 4 and 5 years old, so here I am picturing Christopher Tolkien as a 4 or 5 year old, and that's pretty easy to do since I've got a 5-year-old.
That's just the age of our sons.
Of our boys.
Right in there, yeah.
So he also remembered that I was greatly concerned with petty consistency as the story unfolded, and I can tell you that's true. I'm reading the total digression. I'm reading the Chronicles of Narnia right now to my son. And
are you really?
Yeah. We're on the 4th book, I think.
Are you really? We're on the 2nd.
Yeah, he loves it. I mean, it's just complicated enough for him to stop and ask questions, but it's not so complicated like The Lord of the Rings or even to some extent The Hobbit itself.
Yeah.
So anyway, back to the...
I've done The Hobbit with my son, and it's...
Yeah, I know. You did it early. He was only 3, huh?
And it was he stopped to ask a lot of questions, but then he wanted Lord of the Rings after that, but I said no, dude, you're not ready for that,
dude. No,
so
not a chance.
That's when I went to Narnia, and I'm doing.
I'm not dealing with Nazgul nightmares.
No, absolutely not. No. So I'm like, here, this book was written by the friend of the guy who wrote The Hobbit. Here, we're going to read these books, and he's digging Narnia. So.
Oh yeah, Oh, man,
Anyway.
so is my son. Absolutely loving it. But
Anyway, we
so
digress.
going
Sorry.
back to this, because I totally can see this because he's the same way. He's an absolute stickler for detail, and he wants to know. So here's for the 4 or 5-year-old Christopher Tolkien, greatly concerned with petty consistency as the story unfolded. And then on one occasion I interrupted, last time you said Bilbo's front door was blue, and you said that Thorin had a golden tassel on his hood, but you've just said that Bilbo's front door was green, and that Thorin's hood was silver. At which my father muttered, damn the boy, and then strode across the room to his desk to make a note.
I love that.
That is brilliant.
That one, I cracked up reading that one.
Just absolutely phenomenal. I know that they're talking about making, I think there's 2 biopics in the works for Tolkien's life.
I believe so.
And I tell you, if they do, I'd love to have this.
I would love to see one with the Tolkien children. Yeah.
And Tolkien himself saying, damn the boy.
Yeah,
and walking across the room to make a note.
I know, it's great. Well,
good
and,
stuff.
having read, so much of what Christopher Tolkien did in putting his father's text together.
Yeah.
I mean,
He's so precise,
he's
it's not
meticulous
surprising.
and precise.
I know.
I mean, he has a real love for accuracy there, and
does.
thank goodness for us that he does.
Oh,
but
yeah,
I can imagine it being very frustrating for a father,
I could just see him kind of rolling his eyes like,
especially as
"Man,
he's trying to write this story.
Can't get anything past the kid.
Right? Yeah, it's great. I love it.
That is awesome stuff.
Yeah.
My
We
goodness.
probably need to make a little point about the address, right? The 22 Northmore Road.
yeah,
And
yeah.
the timing of this, because I think, not to question Christopher's recollection, but I think Ratliff has done a lot of work on the true chronology, and he has reasons to believe that maybe it was actually a little later, that maybe the kids' recollections might have been, a little off. Maybe it was actually at after they moved to 20 Northmore Road, which was in 1930. I don't have the book in front of me, and I can't remember all the details of like how he arrived at this. But we'll talk about
and the letter
what he
that I
nailed
just
down his
read, or I should say, the recollection I read is Christopher's recollection of his brother's recollection.
Okay,
Right? I mean, it's
So that was
because
Mike-
Christopher
that's right,
himself
'cause
was
that's
4 or
Michael.
5.
That's
doesn't
right.
remember it himself.
So he wouldn't
goes-
remember. So he's going
No.
from Michael's recollection.
He's
right?
saying that Michael remembered when this happened. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But again, that's example of like the great kind of stuff that's in Ratliff's book is, he goes through all this family,
So
all
much
these family
detail.
records and recollections and figures out, well, this doesn't quite match up,
Yeah.
and this does. And it's a great book. But, there's another recollection that I remember, and I think this one was from Christopher, because Christopher actually mentioned it in one of his letters to Father Christmas. Those of you who remember our episode when we read
that was fun.
Tolkien's letters from Father Christmas back to the kids, one of his letters that he wrote to Father Christmas actually in 1937. So this would have been the year The Hobbit was finally published. I think that was when Christopher said, Daddy wrote it ages ago and read it to John, Michael, and me in our winter reads after tea in the evening. But the ending chapters were rather roughly done and not typed out at all. He finished it about a year ago. So that gives us a date of 1936 being when it was finished, which is probably
makes sense for
when he actually got the
1937
typescript
publication.
off to Allen and Unwin and everything. Yeah.
Yeah, and then that would give him time to do all the...
Yeah. But
the
clearly,
proofs and things.
clearly, as I think we all can probably guess, this story was a huge part of the Tolkien children's lives.
Oh, yeah.
And that's really cool.
It really is. I love it. Well, and it's so much a part of their lives that, Michael Tolkien ended up making up characters that were clearly...
Right.
What I was reading a few of them. Philpot Buggins.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, man.
And then
there were a bunch of others,
was
too.
there like Ollum, the giant
Ollum.
frog, and
That's right.
the wizards. There's like the Scandalf, the bean piper.
Scandalf. I know. Scandalf.
So
that's exactly what kids do. They take the sound and they kind of just tweak it a little bit.
Yeah.
That's hilarious stuff.
Yeah,
But
it's definitely, clearly just such a huge part of their lives, and that's so cool.
Yeah, that's the thing. But Ratliff, really sorted through all that evidence, like you said, and he's his claim, he lands very firmly. He says that with some confidence that the story was indeed begun in the summer of 1930 and completed in January 1933.
Right.
So,
yeah.
I mean, we're not going to go into all the supporting detail, but trust me, he makes a compelling argument. For that.
Absolutely compelling argument, and I would definitely, I trust his assertion on this, and
even though it flies directly in contradiction to the recollections
to some of the
Tolkien
memories.
children.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, he seems to have done his homework, and he lays it all out really nicely. And just this is all just in the introduction to that book, which is
like
pretty
the first
amazing.
20 or 30 pages.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I really liked about the Ratliff, Ratliff's look at this whole thing was just the way he looked at the paper that was used, and he looked at the writing style of the manuscript, and he actually figured out that the manuscript was written in these bursts during vacations between academic semesters. So
that makes sense.
That's when Tolkien's got his free time, right? So he's not writing this whole thing while he's grading papers. He's taking breaks,
true.
and he's writing it during his breaks. And so because of that, Ratliff has identified 3 sudden and marked changes. I'm quoting from Ratliff here. 3 sudden and marked changes in writing paper and handwriting that mark the long hiatuses between these different.
And that makes sense. It's something
so
you
we're
wouldn't
looking
pick
at
up if
basically
he was
4.
just typing.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I was just saying it's the kind of thing you wouldn't pick up on if he was just typing it on a word processor on a computer. It's neat that because this happened then, we're able to really, of course, then again, those things would be timestamps. So never mind.
Well, that's a good point. But yeah, so I mean, Ratliff's just done a ton of work. If we haven't convinced you yet to go out and buy a copy of this book, The History of the Hobbit, seriously, just go out and buy The History of the Hobbit. It's
you really should. It's just keep in mind, it's not like something you're going to sit down and read, one evening.
No, it's a great analysis. It's actually got the whole text of the manuscript / typescript. Published, and then he's got all these great little essays. We've got, there's things in there like the names of, goblins, not the names of goblins, but the name, the word goblins, and the stuff about the Arkenstone. Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, which we referenced back when we were talking about the Silmaril, Eorknestan, right? How the Arkenstone was really kind of inspired by his own.
Inspired by the Silmarils, yeah. Not the Silmarils, but inspired by the Silmarils, and I think we talked about that a little bit with Corey Olsen too.
We did.
But it's a fantastic analysis of basically everything up to the publication of The Hobbit, and I just think it's a nice companion to the Annotated Hobbit, which is probably the more approachable work that kind of gives you more of the history of the book after publication and some of the changes that were made after.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, there's in Ratliff's book we get this breakdown of the composition of these 3 phases. There's 6 pages of manuscript that he calls, and I'm probably not even going to pronounce this right, Prifton, the Prifton fragment.
That's how I think of it. Yeah, Prifton.
I think of it too. I mean, the name of the dragon back then was called Prifton.
Smaug was actually Prifton in that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that also includes 12 pages of typed script that I believe he called the Bladorthan or Bladderthan type script because that's what Gandalf's name was at that point.
That's what the wizard was called, yeah. And
Thank
Gandalf
goodness
was
he got a new name.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I kind of like Bladderthin. If it's pronounced Bladderthin, I kind of like that. Well, no, I don't like Bladderthin. Never mind. As soon as I said it aloud, I realized I don't like it.
That's exactly right. I'm sure it's Bladorthin.
It's probably Bladorthin. You're probably right, but that just sounds like a pharmaceutical.
I was about to say that. It does sound like.
But yeah, in that early version, because
for your blood pressure needs, please speak with a physician.
Please speak with a physician before taking Bladorthin.
Yeah.
Bladorthin may make you late for dinner, may take you on adventures, may hook you up with dwarves.
Certain side effects have been noted.
Yeah. Side effects include finding magic rings,
including
finding your Tookish side.
There you go.
Yeah, anyway.
And there's a second phase, and he talks about that, and where it gets the story up to right before the breakout of the war, the gathering of the clouds. There is a chunk in there where he stopped writing, and then of course, the third phase, which is the rest of the story that he wrote after the gathering of the clouds. So you really see the time that it took Tolkien to write each segment of the story, and you get all the manuscript and typescript that developed behind it before it got to the final version. So it's really cool. Kind of like
and that's something you don't get.
And that's something
you don't get in Carpenter's book.
Oh, not at all.
Carpenter's book has that little passage, about imagining Tolkien at his writing desk every night, and Ratliff, has found pretty conclusively, it seems, that really wasn't the case. It was these bursts and these long hiatuses.
That makes sense. He was using his spare time, and as Tom Shippey told us, how much is a professor's spare time worth?
Right.
Well, we are in a unique position to tell you absolutely nothing.
Very well done. Well done. And I love.
If he ever hears that, I'm going to be in so much trouble.
I love the Shippy's observation that Tolkien was probably using the Oxford.
Oh yes, school ink from the school well. Yeah. Man, good stuff. Oh my! Now one important thing, especially because we're coming to this from the Silmarillion, is that when he was working on this, it was not originally supposed to be connected with the Silmarillion material. It's
true. Yeah.
That's key, because I think that's why there's such a tonal difference between those two works. I mean, you think there's a tonal difference between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Let me just tell you, there's a huge tone difference between The Hobbit and the Silmarillion. In a 1964 letter to Christopher Bretherton, I don't know who or what he is, but it's letter 257, Tolkien said that by the time The Hobbit appeared, which was 1937, this matter of the elder days was in coherent form. The Hobbit was not intended to have anything to do with it. It had no necessary connection with the mythology, but naturally became attracted toward this dominant construction in my mind, causing the tale to become larger and more heroic as it proceeded. Even so, it could really stand quite apart except for the references, and he goes on to think like references to Gondolin and stuff like that.
Right, Gondolin and Elrond. And,
right.
Yeah. And the three kindreds of elves and so forth. Yeah. And I like this the way he describes this as, the tale becoming larger and more heroic as it proceeded, because you certainly see that in the book itself.
You really do.
You look at, things like the Battle of the Five Armies compared to, the beginning of the story, maybe the encounter with the three trolls. It's just much bigger. It's much bigger scope.
Yeah, more heroic, like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think you really get the sense that it was the time he spent with it that kind of, made it change. There's there's also the letter to W.H. Auden, letter 163, where Tolkien said, "The Hobbit was originally quite unconnected, though inevitably got drawn into the circumference of the greater construction, that being, the mythology of the first age, and in the event modified it."
Which of course it did, yeah.
It starts out unconnected, then it becomes a part of it, and then ends up...
And then modifies it.
Having this, irrevocable change on the entire mythology, so much so that Lord of the Rings is now the main story of it. Really fascinating how that happened.
And I love both of those letters, but he said it best in our favorite letter, the one we reference nearly every episode, letter number 131, to good old Milton Waldman. The Hobbit, which has much more essential life in it, was quite independently conceived. I didn't know as I began it that it belonged, but it proved to be the discovery of the completion of the whole, its mode of descent to earth and merging into history. As the high legends of the beginning are supposed to look at things through elvish minds, so the middle tale of The Hobbit takes a virtually human point of view. And the last tale, he's talking about Lord of the Rings, blends them.
I love that.
I know. Isn't that great?
The descent, this image of the descent to earth of the Silmarillion matter.
I know.
And this, merging into history, becoming less mythological and becoming more historical.
Absolutely.
And that's what you see with The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings.
Something we talked about even from the beginning of the Silmarillion, right? You get, the grand creation of the universe, and then we start to get, epic stories, and then turning into less epic and more heroic.
And it becomes, right, exactly.
The scale goes from vast to small, but still on that elvish scale.
Right.
Well, even the tales of Beren and Luthien, even though it's Beren, it's still an elvish tale.
Absolutely, because the elves are still, sort of the movers and shakers of the first age.
Yeah, they absolutely are.
Even
and then that transitions in The Hobbit to be this human point of view through the hobbits. I mean,
Right, of course, yeah. The hobbits, being a subset of men, yeah.
Exactly, and then the blending of them in The Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I love that because, this we talked so much about the Silmarillion and the some have saids of the Silmarillion, and remember that those are elvish tales passed on through men. Those are all orally transmitted stories, whereas The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings within the legendarium, they are first-hand accounts.
Yes,
and so they really are historical, with, of course, a few embellishments from Bilbo.
Just a few. Good stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the composition, the actual process of writing the story.
Right.
Let's go ahead and talk about what it was like to actually get this thing published.
Yeah, I mean, I think the story is really it's just as good a story, I'd say. I mean,
it is. It is.
So once he had this complete home manuscript.
The one he'd been reading to his kids.
The one he'd been reading to his kids, and it's sort of cobbled together, different typefaces and things like that.
Right.
He started loaning it out to his friends, I know, right?
I know.
Brave man.
Brave man, and I'm thinking, what lucky friends.
Oh, that too, yeah. Well, of course, not surprisingly, C.S. Lewis was one of the first people to read it. There's a fantastic quote by C.S. Lewis about reading The Hobbit for the first time. It's actually from, I just saw it. I saw it in a meme online not long ago. So it's definitely going around. But this one's from a 1933 letter to his friend Arthur Greaves, and he wrote to his friend, "Since term, I have had a delightful time reading a children's story, which Tolkien has just written. I have told of him before, the one man absolutely fitted, if fate had allowed, to be a third in our friendship in the old days, for he also grew up on W. Morris and George MacDonald. Reading his fairy tale has been uncanny. It is so exactly like what we would both have longed to write or read in 1916, so that one feels he is not making it up, but merely describing the same world into which all three of us have the entry. Whether it is really good, I think it is till the end, is of course another question. Still more, whether it will succeed with modern children."
Yeah, good question. Interesting that he didn't like
such
the
a cool
end.
quote.
Yeah, it
I
is.
know, yeah.
I do love that. I mean, he really does capture that, doesn't it? This idea that this is a world, this is a story we would have wanted to read when we were young.
Yeah.
And not little. I mean, 1916, right before the breakout of World War I, we're talking about young adults here, not young kids. But,
Right.
He'd had this depth of appreciation of fantasy.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I love that description of describing a world into which all three of us have the entry. First of all, it reminds me incredibly of Narnia.
Doesn't it? Yeah, the door, knowing where the doors are.
Yeah. But, it's such a great metaphor for this idea of this secondary world. It becomes this real world.
Fairy,
it's there whether you're reading it or not.
Yeah.
And the book is just an entry point into that. And I thought that was really cool. And
Absolutely.
Just a neat quote about, you get a little bit of, you see a little bit of their friendship, Lewis and Tolkien's friendship. You kind of sense this kindred spirit that he recognized.
I'm hoping we get to
Tolkien.
touch more on that at some point. Maybe a Tolkien Fun Fact
We should,
down the road.
yeah, we should look into that.
There was some tension there too. I mean, there is a letter that Tolkien wrote that really slammed Lewis for his view on divorce. Because of Tolkien's strong Catholic upbringing. But we won't go into that sidebar right now. But they did have their little battles.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But they were, their friendship was amazing, and
Well, and Tolkien seems like a man who was, who had these friendships with people he could disagree with.
Absolutely.
About
look at the letters we read in Tolkien and the Great War that went back and forth between him and his
him and Christopher Wiseman. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that. He kind of thrived on that sort of opposite nature.
He really did. And always with respect and love.
Yeah, I think Lewis was like that too. I mean, if you read a little bit about Owen Barfield, the one who wrote Poetic Diction, who was one of the, I guess, sort of a sometime inkling. But he and Lewis were like that too. They were really good friends, but they just disagreed about so much. But they just thrived on it. I guess they just learned so much from each other. And
that would be a really interesting topic to explore sometime, just because I think that's lost today. You look in today's, cultural, political environment especially, and you really, it's hard to have a dear friend with whom you disagree.
It's true. Yeah.
Because everything's so polarized today, and there's just not that same respect for,
for a differing opinion.
For a disagreement, for just a different opinion. Yeah. Suddenly it makes
for that idea of I may disagree with you, but I respect your intelligence, and I appreciate that you have the same conviction about your belief that I do.
Right.
It's a very cool thing, a very inspiring thing that I see with the Inklings.
It is. I agree. So, he'd loaned it to Lewis, but he'd also loaned it, and this was important, to another friend of his, Elaine Griffiths. Now, she was another philologist doing research on Middle English. I believe she had been commissioned by his publisher, by his eventual publisher,
who became his
publisher at the time, Allen and Unwin, to do a revision of a revised translation of Beowulf.
Right. Yeah.
She was visited in 1936 by Susan Dagnall, who worked for Allen and Unwin.
Right.
So apparently Griffiths, recommended that Dagnall go visit Tolkien to talk to him about The Hobbit that he was working on, so she could give it a read.
Yeah. She said,
and Dagnall came.
Yeah, very well done. Yeah,
From the depths of her dungeon, she came.
Dagnall came. Really amazing story to think that, Elaine Griffiths, says to this Susan Dagnall,
so much to do with this.
Go see this Tolkien. And I think Dagnall may have known Tolkien
Yeah.
as well. I think there's speculation that she may have. Tolkien was involved in this Beowulf translation,
Right.
to some degree, I think, in a limited
it was.
fashion. But yeah, I mean, it's just this idea of like, hey, go pay Tolkien a visit and take a look at this Hobbit thing he's working on.
I can just hear it now. It's in the Elven King's voice as he says, "There is a man you must see. He lives in the north.
He's only 8 years old now.
He is writing a book for 8-year-olds.
They call him Tollers. What his real name is, you must find out for yourself."
Find out for yourself. Sorry, we did of course record our episode on the Hobbit films not too long ago, and that
yes, we did.
terrible line is rattling around in my brain.
It is still fresh in your mind, apparently.
Yeah, fresh like the truck of fertilizer outside.
You haven't shaken that one off yet.
I keep showering, and it still sticks. I just can't. Anyway.
Why does it hurt so much? Why does it hurt so much? Anywho,
Shawn, thank you so much. I'm going to have nightmares tonight. I appreciate that.
It's what I do. It's what I do, my friend. So Susan Dagnall, Allen and Unwin employee, got a hold of the manuscript from Tolkien and apparently loved it. She encouraged Tolkien to finish it, and she said, send it to Allen and Unwin. I think this is, something we would be interested in publishing.
We might be able to work with this.
Yeah, right, yeah. Exactly. And so he did,
He did.
obviously. He sent a typescript to Allen and Unwin on October 3rd, 1936.
And that's the typescript that Sir Stanley Unwin handed to his son. We've all heard this story, right?
Yes, this is a great story.
So Rayner, 10 years old, I love this. I cannot wait to read this, did a book report. If I remember correctly, he was paid...
Was it like a shilling per report?
A shilling. I think it was a shilling per review.
Yeah.
So young Rayner said, and I'm going to call out the errors too, because they don't all show up in pronunciation.
Please do. Yeah, because really, you kind of need to see it to appreciate it.
Yeah, they're typical
10-year-old misspellings. Yeah, they're great.
Bilbo Baggins was a hobbit who lived in his hobbit hole and never went for adventures. At last, Gandalf the wizard and his dwarves persuaded him to go, and persuaded is spelled Perswaded.
I love that.
Like wading out into the water. He had a very exiting time. He meant exciting, but he spelled it exiting.
Exiting.
A very exiting time fighting goblins and wargs. At last they got to the Lonely Mountain, actually, is how he spelled that.
Lonley, right?
Lonley. Smaug the dragon who guards it, Gawreds. I want to pronounce that Gawreds, but Gawreds.
Yeah.
So Smaug, the dragon who Gawreds it, is killed, and after a terrific battle with the goblins, he returned home rich.
Exclamation
Apparently that's
point.
very important to young Rayner Unwin, who was only getting a shilling for this report. Cheap dad.
Thanks,
Rich dad, poor son.
Yeah.
This book, with the help of maps, does not need any illustrations. It is good and should appeal to all children between the ages of 5 and 9, says the 10-year-old.
Says the 10-year-old, which I love.
Is that the most condescending
It's that little backhanded compliment.
It really is. It's awesome. It's like, well, I'm too old for this childish tripe, but my 9-year-old friends would love it.
Right. Exactly. That's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant.
Well done.
And one thing I love about that is, you pointed out the misspellings.
Brilliant.
Persuaded and guards.
Gawreds.
The kid spelled wizard and goblin and warg perfectly.
I know. And even Smaug.
And I love that. It is
hilarious.
It's the stuff that you would think a 10-year-old would pick up on.
It's
great.
It's brilliant stuff. Absolutely hilarious.
Yeah, and that was that. I mean, the rest, as they say, was history. Yeah,
you're right.
They Allen and Unwin accepted the book, and they ended up, I think, signing the contracts in December 1936.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Now, Tolkien had a lot to say about the final product. I'm not sure how much say authors have these days, but he got to write his own marketing blurb for the dust jacket, supply his own cover art, and several of his illustrations were included in the book as well.
I would say, despite Rayner's suggestion that it doesn't need any illustrations except for maps.
Doesn't need any illustrations.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I guess Alan Lee's out of a job.
But yeah, they let Tolkien supply his own, which was pretty cool. I think,
which is amazing too.
Yeah,
his artwork. If we don't have a link up, we should put a link to not only the Art of the Lord of the Rings, but the Art of the Hobbit. Now, I know we gave away a copy of the Art of the Lord of the Rings, so that's, I'm sure, on our library. But we'll have to make sure that the Art of the Hobbit is in there too, because it's spectacular.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Good stuff. So, but of course, he had a chance to proof the final copy. And he made some changes to the story in classic Tolkien fashion. I believe his quote was something like, "There were considerable confusions of narrative and geography, and he had to rectify narrative errors that escaped my previous care."
Yeah.
Very Tolkien.
And I think one thing I remember reading about that is that he would replace huge sections of text,
chunks. Yeah.
But he did his best to make sure that what he replaced it with was the same size, right?
Oh yeah,
wasn't it? Mm-hmm. And he was being considerate of the typesetters.
Well, and because he also was concerned, they knew there was a cost involved in if the book became significantly longer.
Right.
That ended up being
brilliant. Such attention to detail.
Oh, very, very. Like you said the last time when we were talking about the films, how when he modified Chapter 5, he did it in a very economical way. Mm-hmm. He didn't make. He would take one line and change a single word, and it would just absolutely change the entire meaning of that paragraph.
Right.
And that's the kind of thing that he would do. But here
he's a master at that. Yeah.
Bigger stuff. Yeah, he truly is.
Yeah.
So it ended up took another 9 months for it to get set to go to print, and was published, as we all know, 3 days ago and 80 years on September 21st, 1937.
A date that's, I think, burned into the brains of all Tolkien fans.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Initial print run was 1,500 copies, I believe.
Yeah, a little pessimistic.
But it sold so well that the second printing was actually needed before Christmas.
Yeah,
so
just a couple months later.
They sold those in, under 3 months.
2-3 months, yeah.
And, does the first... You're the book collector here. The first edition, first print. Those things go
goodness.
for.
I'm not going to be a collector
serious
of those.
money, right?
Yeah, they're very serious money. There was a Sotheby's auction a couple of years ago where a first impression. Now, the reason I want to be careful to use terms correctly. Okay. First edition, there were, I don't know how many impressions there were of that, but those are print runs. So then each print run is an impression, not an edition. So that means because they didn't change the text.
And I'm sorry, I'm not a book collector at all.
Typographical errors.
Is impression the same as printing? So when you say first edition, first printing?
Yeah, it's the first printing, right.
Okay.
It's the first, because the type is impressed into the paper, right? It's an impression.
Right. Okay.
First impression.
I am not a book collector at all, so.
I'm only marginally a book collector. I'm a Tolkien book collector. I don't have a lot of. I don't collect anybody else.
I have a collection, but it's like I'm not.
I would love over time to collect a first edition, first impression of each of the titles. But obviously, I'm never going to be able to do that for The Hobbit, or even realistically for The Lord of the Rings. The cost is just outrageous. But to give you an idea of that, this first impression copy, back in 2 years ago for that Sotheby's auction, sold for £137,000, which at the time was a little over $200,000. Now, in all fairness, that copy was signed and personally inscribed with a poem in Old English.
Okay, all right.
So
well,
that's really what the buyer was buying. A run-of-the-mill unsigned copy, one of the 1,500 first impressions, had sold a year before that at a different auction for $24,000. So that's probably more.
Only $24,000.
Only the price of your car.
Right. Yeah.
Or for a year of college.
That is awesome. My hat is off to the serious Tolkien collectors. I respect what the collectors do.
I'm not going to be collecting
I got kids. I got kids to send to college, so I guess I'll just stick with my first edition facsimile.
Yeah, seriously, I'm glad they did that first edition facsimile because, it gives us a chance to actually see that text in its context. and read it the way people would have read it 80 years ago.
Yeah.
So fun to read it like that. It really is.
Yeah, and I know there were some issues with some of those, but I managed to get one of the good ones. So
my understanding, I think, is the HarperCollins, the UK prints were all fine, but a number of the Houghton Mifflin US prints had some issues. Though I don't recall now what the issues were.
I want to say it was something with the maps. Wasn't there
the
an
map
issue
was
with
in
the
upside
maps
down.
being printed upside down?
Yeah, it was inserted upside down.
And maybe some of them were switched. The map that's supposed to go on the front was actually in the back.
That sounds right. I think I recall somebody telling us that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I have had a really nice, what I thought was a really nice, beautiful, single volume edition with the Alan Lee illustrations. Gorgeous book. And then it turns out that at one point you start reading and it's repeating itself. There's an entire extra sleeve of papers in there.
Oh, no.
So it adds like 60 pages.
Oh, wow.
It's like, wait a minute. That's the same picture I just saw.
I read this already.
I read this. Wait a minute. Yeah, really frustrating.
Man.
But
yeah.
it is what it is.
No, but I'm glad it's out there. I love the fact that the first edition facsimile is out there. And
so do I.
Again, I'm happy that I got one. I guess because I got one of the UK editions, I got lucky.
Yeah, I did too.
But it's such a cool thing to have, and you can pretend that it's one of the first edition, the actual first edition, and you get to see all the stuff that was in there before he made the changes to bring it up to date with Lord of the Rings, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Absolutely, and I do believe that the edition that we have for the giveaway that we'll be talking about later is a UK edition, so it should be error-free.
That's what I thought. Very good.
Yeah, well, let's move on from the publication to the reception. How was this received by the critics? How did Rotten Tomatoes, rate it?
the aggregator.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that was really interesting to me, and you get a lot of this in Douglas Anderson's Annotated Hobbit. He's got a lot of this in the introduction.
That's true. A lot of this does come from there.
Yeah, and I'm actually quite surprised reading it because, we think of all the criticism that Tolkien has gotten from, I'm going to make air quotes here, so-called serious literary critics.
Right.
How much he's really been attacked by, the people who define literary taste. But it really sounds like the response was fairly positive when it came out. And I think, for
the most part, yeah.
Some of that comes from he had some friends write some reviews for him.
That always helps.
If
I write a book, Shawn, would you do me a favor and write a review?
I would, Alan. I would gladly do it. But yeah, so I mean, the first two published reviews were done by C.S. Lewis, conveniently.
One of them anonymously, right? I mean, I don't think his name was associated with one of them.
I believe so. Yeah. And he did one in the Times Literary Supplement, and then he did one in the Times, the actual parent publication.
Right.
So I actually have some quotes from some of those here. In the Times Literary Supplement, he said that The Hobbit was one of a very small class of books which have nothing in common, save that each admits us to a world of its own, a world that seems to have been going on before we stumbled into it, but which, once found by the right reader, becomes indispensable to him. Its places with Alice, Flatland, Phantastes, Wind in the Willows. I love that. It kind of reminds me of the quote, he said to his friend, in that letter that we talked about a minute ago,
right.
About this world that you kind of walk into. And I love the comparison to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, The Wind in the Willows, which is a personal favorite of mine, and I believe it was also one that Tolkien loved as well. So I love what he's done with that. There was let's see, I think he went on to say.
This was in the second. I think this is in the other review of the Times.
I think in the Times.
No, you're right.
You've got the quote from the Times, but yeah, I've got this other paragraph from the literary supplement that I wanted to read. Going back to Alice in Wonderland, he says, "Alice is read gravely by children and with laughter by grown-ups. The Hobbit, on the other hand, will be funniest to its youngest readers. And only years later, at a 10th or 20th reading, will they begin to realize what deft scholarship and profound reflection have gone to make everything in it so ripe, so friendly, and in its own way so true.
Oh, yeah.
Prediction is dangerous, but The Hobbit may well prove a classic."
It may well. This young Tolkien guy, he has something going for him.
He's got something going for him.
You know what? He's absolutely right about what he says. I love that comparison, because you're right. Alice is a little scary for kids, and grown-ups are like, this is nonsense. So it's laughter, but The Hobbit's
Right.
flipped because he writes it with such care to not scare kids.
Yeah. Well,
And
and you, I mean, I think he was deliberate, very deliberate
very
about that.
deliberate,
And, I
very
think Corey
deliberate.
Olsen did a really good analysis of that in his book.
He did. It was really eye-opening, I thought.
Yeah.
In talking about that, like I'm thinking of the trolls,
Yeah.
That should flat out be terrifying.
Right.
Flat out terrifying. These guys are talking about eating you, but as a
But
kid,
with the
you're
way they
skipping
talk,
over that.
Yeah. The way they talk and then referring to their mode of speech as not drawing room fashion at all,
Not at all. I love that.
Not at all. He really brings it down to that sillier level, and I think he makes it more accessible for kids and not traumatizing for kids. But he doesn't sanitize it. You don't feel like he's sanitizing
there's a difference. He doesn't. Yeah. Man, that is it. It's so important, and I can't wait till we get to some examples of that. I mean, obviously, Trolls is probably one of the biggest, most clear examples. But even at the beginning, even the conversation he has with the dwarves, he does a really good job of kind of hiding the risk that Bilbo's looking at.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Amazing stuff.
Yeah.
And yes, The Hobbit may well prove a classic.
May well
I love
prove a
that.
classic, yes. Here we
Understatement.
are talking about it 80 years
80
later.
years later. How many other books that are around for 80 years do we, talk about?
Right.
Now, Lewis also wrote, and this is the one that you were mentioning, I have this quote from the Times itself. So this is
Right.
the parent publication, and this was published like a week later in October of 1937. The truth is that in this book, a number of good things, never before united, have come together. A fund of humor, an understanding of children, and a happy fusion of the scholar's wit with the poet's grasp of mythology. On the edge of a valley, one of Professor Tolkien's characters can pause and say, "It smells like elves."
You know how much I love that one.
Yeah, I know. You wrote a pondering on that. It may be years before we produce another author with such a nose for an elf. The professor has the air of inventing nothing. He has studied trolls and dragons at first hand and describes them with that fidelity which is worth oceans of glib originality. I love that, how he dismisses that at the end. Yes.
I love that, the air of inventing nothing.
Yeah, he's just discovering these things.
He's discovering this place, and he's just describing
He's
this
studied
world
it.
that he's found.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Man,
It's incredible stuff.
Lewis really had insight there, didn't he?
Yeah, he really did. And
I mean, it wasn't just like he was blowing smoke and giving his friend a 5-star review. He was writing a real legitimate review.
It really was. And he's not the only person who said, The Hobbit would become a classic. There was at least one other reviewer that, that talked about that. I mean, he wasn't the only person to do things like make the connection to Alice, Of course, to be fair, the publishers did mention Alice on the Dust Jacket blurb.
Well, there is that. Yeah, they did.
So I guess there's that. But I think a lot of reviewers sort of latched onto it.
Yeah.
But no, I think you're right. I think Lewis he was giving a really honest review. I mean, he really felt this way. And I think, having read the book, I think we understand where he was coming from with that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Wasn't entirely positive reception, though, was it?
No, no.
I've actually got one negative review here. This was by an Eleanor Graham in a publication called Junior Bookshelf, where she said, "The Hobbit is a strange book. It has in it the makings of a very good story, or perhaps a book of short stories for children, but it is marred, in my opinion, by some reflection of the author's attitude towards the world. A sort of Aunt Sally spirit replaced the benevolence which is notable in the most loved books for children. Instead of natural obstacles in the path of achievement, the journey of the Hobbit and his companions is interrupted by obstructions which somehow give the effect of deliberately intentional setbacks, and not of natural developments." Which is an interesting... she did go on to say, those people who like it will like it very much indeed.
Oh, my goodness.
Which I'm not sure
true.
is meant as a compliment.
No, I don't think it is, but it's certainly true.
But it's almost a bit dismissive, like, oh, well, those people who actually get into this sort of thing, oh, they're going to love it. But
and they'll go see the movie 50 times.
Right, exactly.
I did the math. She had to watch this movie every day and twice on
Sundays. Go listen to the Shippey lecture if you haven't listened to it
do
yet.
It now.
Episode 50 and 51. It's in our show notes. Go listen
Good
to
stuff. A quick sidebar on this. I had to, when I read this quote, I'm like, what in the world is an Aunt Sally spirit? Now, I happen to remember reading The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn when I was young. And in that story, there's a minor character, not that minor, but somewhat minor, Aunt Sally, who's a farmer's wife who intends to adopt and civilize Huck. But I don't think that's what this means.
Probably not, no.
Pardon our American lack of knowledge, but apparently there exists a traditional fairground and pub game in England called Aunt Sally, where players throw sticks at the head of an old woman. Okay, a model of an old woman.
Thankfully. Okay, good.
All right, I'll volunteer. Fine.
We need an old woman for our Aunt Sally game.
Ow! Ow! Stop that!
I feel fine. Sorry.
So apparently these days, and yes, it is still played. It's just a ball and a stick, but that's progress for you. So apparently what this critic was saying was that Tolkien, instead
we don't want
to
be barbarians here.
No, we're not going to be.
Sorry, please continue.
I mean, I'm thinking how much criticism people would get if they were at a pub throwing sticks at the head of a woman.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably not very 21st century. Let's just put a ball on a stick. So what this critic was saying, in essence, was that Tolkien, instead of being benevolent like other children's authors with the character, was throwing sticks at Bilbo. That the troubles he encountered weren't natural developments, but troubles thrown at him like the sticks at the head of Aunt Sally.
So she's kind of speaking to a kind of cruelty, like as if Tolkien is kind of cruelly throwing things in, right?
I mean, that's kind of randomly. I think her criticism is that it feels forced, that they weren't natural obstacles in the path of achievement. They were like, whoa, hey, there's this stick flying towards me. Yeah.
Okay, because I'm latching onto this word benevolence. She's saying this spirit replaces the benevolence, and that makes me
maybe
feel
a little
like,
bit of that. Yeah, you're right. Benevolence
she's implying there's a malevolence there. But
yeah, you're right, because she does talk about replacing the benevolence with this Aunt Sally spirit, and the Aunt Sally spirit is this stick-throwing spirit.
That's very interesting.
So how's that for some kind of word nerdery? I usually let you find those things.
That's
out,
great. No, I'm glad you found that. Yeah,
we're going to go ahead.
You told me you actually found. Was there a video of this?
Yes, there's a video. I found a video on YouTube of a couple of old guys in a pub playing some sort of singles championship of Aunt Sally. So we're going to put that link in our show notes to give you some laughs.
I think we have to. Yeah.
Good stuff.
Yeah. Well, so I guess that's that was a good overview of some of the UK response. We'll spend maybe just a little time on some of the US responses because we're Americans. I think we're interested in how it was received over here. The Hobbit actually came out a little later in the US. It came out in 1938. Coincidentally, just weeks after the release of Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Or dwarves, but they spelled it dwarfs.
Yeah, Walt's terrible version of spelling dwarves.
Yeah. But I found it very interesting that a couple of the American reviewers picked up on, the timing of this. There was one reviewer. There was a May Lamberton Becker who wrote in the New York Herald Tribune that dwarfs have come this year into fashion in America, and perhaps these Tolkien's dwarfs will benefit from the Disney boom.
Ooh, I don't think Tolkien would have liked that very much.
No, I can't imagine that he would have. Although I think that was the same reviewer who picked up on the fact that Tolkien had more in common with is it Lord Dunsany?
Dunsany, yeah.
Yeah, more so than Lewis Carroll, which I thought was neat.
Okay, Lewis Carroll being Alice in Wonderland, and Lord Dunsany being what then?
I will have to look that up, but I know that he's an author that Tolkien actually had read.
Yeah, I just can't remember what though. That's the thing.
Yeah, no, I don't remember.
We'll put it in our show notes.
Yeah. But so yeah, I mean, I think she picked up on that at least.
Yeah.
There's another great one that another reviewer, Sophia Goldsmith, who wrote in the New York Post that Tolkien's dwarves put Snow White's boyfriends completely in the shade, and I kind of love that one.
In the shade, throwing some shade their way on Twitter.
Throwing some shade at the boyfriends. Yep. That was great stuff.
There are two American reviewers, though, who really seem to have picked up on what he was doing, and I loved these two reviews. There was, you've got one of them, but I really like this one. This was from a reviewer named Ann Eaton. She wrote that Tolkien's fantasy landscape was, quote, unmistakably a part of England and of fairyland at the same time. The background of the story is full of authentic bits of mythology and magic, and the book has the rare quality of style. It is written with a quiet humor and the logical detail in which children take delight. And boy, is it. I mean, was that?
Yeah.
That's just spot on.
Yeah.
But you've got another one from the same publication called Hornbook.
The same publication, the Hornbook. There's another reviewer, Anne Carroll Moore. She said, I love this one. She said that The Hobbit was a refreshingly adventurous and original tale of dwarfs again, goblins, elves, dragons, trolls, etc., in the true tradition of the old sagas. Ooh. I think it is a mistake to compare The Hobbit with Alice or with The Wind in the Willows. It is unlike either book. It is firmly rooted in Beowulf and authentic Saxon lore.
Boy, she gets it.
So somebody was paying attention.
Really paying attention.
I think that is super cool.
It really is. I love that. That was fun.
And I've looked at a list of Lord Dunsany's writings, and they are just too many to name here. I
tried to do the same thing while you were reading. And
I will admit he's not a writer that I'm familiar with, except that I know that Tolkien, read a lot of his stuff.
Right.
But,
and yeah, and certainly would have been influenced more by him than by Lewis Carroll with Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so we've looked at the reviews. We've looked at composition and publication and the reviews. And now let's look at what happened after the reviews. He didn't stop changing the story just because it was published. I mean, we all know that the biggest change, the most famous change was what he did after he started developing The Lord of the Rings. When he realized what the ring was and that was going to be the tie between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, he had to make some changes to the original story to make Gollum more corrupted, more evil. I'm going to go ahead and read a fairly lengthy quote. I may skip around a little bit from Skull and Hammond's Reader's Guide. In Chapter 5, as it was first published, Gollum, although willing to kill and eat Bilbo, nonetheless treats the riddle contest as sacred. And when he loses and cannot give Bilbo the present he had promised him, the magic ring that confers invisibility, he apologizes and shows the Hobbit a way out of the caverns. But in The Lord of the Rings, Gollum's ring is revealed to be the One Ring, which corrupts the bearer and would never have been easily given away as a present. And Gollum himself is shown to be exceedingly treacherous, not likely to be courteous or to honor the terms of a riddle game. Mm-hmm. So in the revised version of Chapter 5, which came out in 1951, Gollum doesn't promise a present, and then I'm not back to the quote now, but to show Bilbo a way out should the Hobbit win their contest. And when Bilbo does win, Gollum intends to kill him with the aid of the ring. Even without the ring, he attempts to do so once he realizes that the object is now in Bilbo's possession. As revised, the chapter was now in better accord with the history and nature of the One Ring as it had developed in the sequel. But rather than ignore, this is where the brilliance is, this is where it gets brilliant. Mm-hmm. Rather than ignore the original version of the chapter, Tolkien cleverly decided to embrace it as the story that Bilbo first told to Gandalf and the dwarves and that he wrote down in his memoirs. In The Lord of the Rings, it's made clear that the ring, as part of its attempt to return to its malevolent creator, established an unhealthy hold on Bilbo from the moment that he found it, causing the otherwise honest Hobbit to lie to his companions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
brilliant. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant.
It really is.
We probably call this a retcon today, but the way Tolkien did it was just a stroke of genius. This total in-universe explanation that also shows the hold that the ring already has on Bilbo. He's already being corrupted by the ring. And it's
such a drastic change in the printed story.
Yeah.
And yet he finds a way to explain it within the story itself.
Yeah. And he does it with, and he does it with relatively little,
minimal change, really.
And I know this is something I know we're going to spend a ton of time on Chapter 5.
When we get to Riddles in the Dark, That might be like 4 episodes.
Could be. And I don't want to steal our thunder on it too much. No. But, definitely, if you're not familiar with that being one of the major changes, that really was a big one. And brilliantly done, the way he sort of explained it in universe. There were a few other minor changes, right, throughout. Mm-hmm. There was, like Chapter 3, the original edition, when Elrond talks about the High Elves of Gondolin, he had used the word gnomes there because that was still a word he was using.
Gnomes, there we go again.
There's my gnomes. I love my gnomes.
You're a gnome connoisseur.
Yeah, I'm a gnome connoisseur. That is true.
You're no longer the real-life Lord of the Mark. You're just the gnome connoisseur.
I am the gnome connoisseur and the gnome master. There's Chapter 1. There's the reference to cold chicken and tomatoes in the first first edition.
Yeah.
And then Tolkien changed that to pickles because he wanted to get rid of that reference to a New World vegetable.
Now, I find that interesting because he left several occurrences. I want to say at least 6 or 8 references of the word tobacco, a word which another New World thing that didn't enter English until the mid-16th century out of Spanish. Why do you think he left tobacco in but changed pickles to tomatoes?
I wish I knew.
I know.
I mean, I could speculate. I mean, I actually, we talked about this a little bit before we started recording.
Yeah,
we did. I actually had looked at, there's that book that just came out. It's called The Flora of Middle-earth.
Yeah, I haven't read that yet.
I haven't read it, but I've got a copy on my shelf. It's by Walter Judd and Graham Judd, who I believe one of them is actually a botanist and the other is an illustrator.
Wow. Okay.
And it's just all about the plants of Middle Earth and their real life real life counterparts, things they were inspired by. I looked to see if they had an explanation because they do have some somewhat speculative explanations for things like coffee and things like that.
Okay.
But they didn't. They called out the discrepancy. They called out that it was odd that he called it tobacco, but they didn't really explain it. They just kind of left it there. One thing that I can imagine is maybe he was just thinking of it as a translation. Of whatever the real word was in Westron, similar to the way that he translated orc to goblin, and that's something
that's
that
what
he
I was thinking.
describes
Is that
on the
orc
first
goblin
page.
thing? You're right.
Yeah,
that could be it. I mean, it's one of those things where I'm actually glad he left it in because it makes it a little more clear.
Because it makes it a little easier to disprove all the theories of what else pipeweed might be.
Pipeweed, clearly nicotinia, nicotinia. Tobacco and the references to it in The Hobbit really help make that a little more clear.
Yeah.
Now there were other, Go ahead. I'm so sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's easy enough to, again, if he's writing this for children, and as strange as it may seem for us in 2017 to think that one would want to include a reference to tobacco in a children's book, but at the time,
that's a good point.
It was a slightly different world, and I think children were much more familiar with adults around them using tobacco, and I think he just wanted to use that word because it's something children recognize.
Yeah, I think so. Well, and because he was he enjoyed
such an enthusiast himself.
Tobacco.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, he really did. One of my favorite letters is he's talking about how he went to some meeting in Denmark.
Okay.
Maybe Netherlands. It was the Netherlands, and how they gave him special tobacco, like with labels like Long Bottom Leaf and Old Toby and things like that.
Well, you say special tobacco in the Netherlands, my mind goes somewhere else.
This is in 1930s, or 40s, maybe 50s. I don't know, but it wasn't that special. It was actual, real, genuine tobacco.
Okay.
I'll find that letter, maybe reference that or something in our show notes. But there were other changes, and really, if you want to dig into those changes, you can do two things. You can either look in the Annotated Hobbit, or you can really, for fun, you can do the comparative work yourself. Pick up that first edition facsimile, or win it by filling out our listener survey, and compare that to the more recent version, so you can do that.
Yep. Interesting footnote to this whole thing. We won't spend a ton of time on this, but it's interesting to note that Tolkien actually started a full rewrite of The Hobbit in 1960.
Oh, that's right.
After Lord of the Rings. And he was going to try and bring the story more into that epic fantasy style of Lord of the Rings.
That would have been interesting.
He ended up giving it up. I think, probably just the quote that I've got here from Skull and Hammond's Reader's Guide is that, he perhaps recognized that for better or worse, he had created The Hobbit as a children's book and a fairy tale. And that was really the charm of it. So it would have been interesting. I would love to see.
It would have been intriguing, but
I love The Hobbit as it is, and
exactly.
Ironically, as I get older, and maybe it's because having kids myself, I don't know. I really like the nature of The Hobbit. I like it the way it is.
I agree wholeheartedly. Okay, so now we've talked about just about everything about the book itself, except its legacy. So what else can we say?
Well, I mean, I don't think we need to tell anybody listening to this that the Hobbit is the reason that The Lord of the Rings was published later.
Exactly.
And that, of course, is in turn the reason why the Silmarillion was published later.
That's
everything
true.
else that came after that was published was published because of The Hobbit. I mean,
that's a good point. If that had not succeeded, none of the other works would have been written or released.
Right. I mean, and to be fair, Tolkien had a successful career as a philologist, as a professor of Old and Middle English, and I think in certain circles of the world, people would have circles of the world. I shouldn't use that phrase, but in certain circles, academic circles and things, some people would know his name, sure, if The Hobbit had never been published, but we certainly wouldn't be here, would we?
No.
I mean, none of us, would be talking about Tolkien today. And I think I felt this was most beautifully summed up by John Ratliff in the acknowledgments. I don't know if you read all the acknowledgments to the history of the Hobbit.
I haven't yet, no.
There's this long list of acknowledgments and thank yous, and the last one in the list, in this list of thank yous, the last one is, "And to Susan Dagnall for asking."
Oh, wow.
And I love that. I honestly teared up a little reading that because it's like, wow.
Without her, none of this happens.
None of this. Like, how close could we have come to never having had these stories?
I know, because he'd certainly, I don't know, would he ever have pushed to get it published? I don't know. I mean, he seemed to be very content reading it to his kids and letting his friends read it and not. Yeah. Well, I mean, I can tell you this much: the podcast certainly wouldn't be here.
No, it certainly would not.
I wouldn't know you, and nor would I know so many other friends from the Tolkien community around the world.
True. Yeah.
I mean, truth be told, my daughter probably wouldn't be named Eleanor either. We named her after the flower, and
it's definitely. I mean, when you think about, people like us, that Tolkien's world has been so much a part of our lives. Mm-hmm. It's just. The legacy is immeasurable, I think.
Yes, it is.
I mean, I think The Hobbit historically has been most people's introduction to Tolkien. Certainly their introduction to his writing. Now that we've got Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies, which I think are, a pretty good introduction to the world at least. There's probably some people who go straight from those movies to reading Lord of the Rings or something. But certainly before that, people started with The Hobbit, right? I mean, I know I did.
I did too. I mean, I looked into this. I actually couldn't find any hard data regarding which book people read first. But, anecdotally, it really was traditionally the first book people would read, followed by Lord of the Rings and then the Silmarillion, basically published order.
True, yeah.
When the movies came out, I suspect that for a while, between the time the Lord of the Rings came out and the Hobbit films came out, in that interim, the trend may have kind of shifted to be read Lord of the Rings first, because that was the movie, and so then they wanted to read the book.
You'd go straight from that movie to that book.
To the Lord of the Rings.
I wouldn't be surprised if that was,
I suspect that a lot of people were like, wow, I just saw this amazing movie, I should go read the book.
I should go read the book, yeah.
Now that the Hobbit films have been released, maybe it's reverted back to the old tradition of reading the Hobbit first. For those who bother with the books, at least.
Right. Right.
I personally prefer a chronological read-through like we're doing, but in all fairness, we're not even doing a truly pure chronological read.
That's a very good point.
There are people who've broken it down paragraph by paragraph, including stuff out of Unfinished Tales, and that's just a little too crazy for me right now.
Yeah, no, I like to keep it kind of simple, at least kind of simple.
Keep it within the covers of a book at a time.
Right, exactly. Well, with that said, Alan, you want to share your story about the first time you read The Hobbit?
Yeah, sure. I have to say it's hard to recollect a lot of specific details, so, please bear with me. I remember...
I know you've done some hard living.
Me and Kenny Stabler, man, Sorry, nobody that listens to this probably got that. Ken Stabler, the Snake, was the quarterback of the Raiders, famous hard party animal, would go out and get just, blasted on a Saturday night, and then show up with a hangover on Sunday morning and throw for 300 yards and 4 touchdowns.
Wow.
Deserved to be in the Hall of Fame a lot earlier, certainly before he passed away. But I digress. There are probably people who don't even know who the Raiders are.
We've got a few Raiders fans in the audience.
We've got so many international listeners that the Oakland Raiders are a football team in America. That means they don't kick the ball; they pick it up and they run with it or throw it forward.
Right, which is why we call it football here for some strange reason.
Yes, I know. Well, I mean, I guess the kicker kicks it, but that's about it. But
we established earlier when we weren't recording that I'm a soccer fan. So
yes, I enjoy soccer as well. The beautiful game is indeed a beautiful game.
Yeah.
So what I do remember is that though I didn't see it, the Rankin and Bass animated version came out in November of '77. And the book for that, these days, if a movie comes out, the book is out at the same time. Well, so I was thinking that it was probably Christmas.
Matching cover art and everything like that. Yeah.
That didn't happen back then. That actually didn't come out until the fall of the next year. And I know that actually because of the details on the page. I still have my first copy of The Hobbit, and it's the Rankin and Bass animated book. It's the book with stills from the film.
Okay.
Absolutely fabulous, images. Really, for a 10-year-old at that time or an 11-year-old at that time, it was, no, that would have been 10. I was 10. So, yeah, I did get a copy of the book for Christmas in 1978. complete with all the stills. So we're talking about something that happened, nearly 40 years ago. I was negative 7 years. I was negative 7 years old.
Yeah.
I was. Somehow I was actually less than zero. I'd like to think, because I don't want to realize how old that makes me now.
No, you're young at heart.
There you go. What I remember, though, was being just totally fascinated with how incredibly real the world felt. I think that's the thing that sticks with me more than anything else. I wanted to know more about it, to know more about everything, to know more about, the Gondolin and where did these swords come from, and why are there trolls, and who are these elves, and how did a dragon get here, and where are the other dragons? And there's so much I wanted to know, and I didn't even know about the Lord of the Rings. I was an only child. I didn't have a lot of friends, peers. A lot of my friends were older, and so it never came up that I was reading this kid's book, right? Because that's how I viewed it, especially with the animated pictures. But about 4 years later, I'd probably read it about a half dozen times, and then 4 years later, as a freshman in high school in 1982, a friend told me about the Lord of the Rings.
We're all doing the math right now.
I know. Shush. Blah, 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 blah. A friend told me about the Lord of the Rings, and the rest, as they say, is history. So,
nice.
What about you, Shawn?
Nice. That's a good story.
Except for the 1982 part.
Brush over that part.
I was a child genius. I was 4 years old.
Right, of course. You were in high school at 4 years old. Well, my plan is to write my story in a Prancing Pony Pondering, which if I did it when I said I would.
We'll move on. Just kidding.
If I did it when I said I would, it should have come out about a week ago. However,
the vagaries of time travel.
Yes, I know. The miracles of recording. But no, I mean, The Hobbit was, the first thing I ever read by Tolkien.
Sure.
It was 1991. I was a teenager. I was 15, I think.
Oh my goodness.
I didn't know anything about The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings or Middle-earth. I'm sure I'd seen covers, but didn't know anything about the story. What made me want to start reading it was actually, I read, just offhand somewhere, I actually read somewhere the story of how Tolkien started writing it. That story I was just saying sharing a moment ago from Carpenter. And that's what really got me interested in it. I think I was just kind of blown away by the fact that a college professor got bored grading papers one day and then just started writing a novel on an exam. I mean,
that is pretty cool.
That was the coolest thing I'd ever heard of, which probably says quite a bit of, for the
If I look at your schoolwork at that point, am I going to find, the germs of a novel on the back of your English assignment?
Yes, but it's not one that is ever going to see the light of day because it should not see the light of day.
Some things are better left unsaid.
Yes, exactly. I read this story. I thought, oh, that's awesome. I've got to read this book. So I went out and bought a 4-volume paperback box set of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Read them really fast. And I'm actually generally a fairly slow reader. And I know I read these books really fast, in a matter of a couple of weeks.
Sure.
All
four of them.
Yeah, all 4 of them.
That's pretty amazing.
Weeks. Yeah, and it was a summer,
Yeah.
So I had more time, but I read them really fast, and I wanted more. I went straight out and I picked up the Silmarillion.
And you were how old when you picked up the Silmarillion?
15.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to say I understood it, but I picked up on parts of it, and
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it just always. It grabbed me. And, kind of like what you're saying about this world that you just wanted to know more about. The world felt so real.
Was that depth?
That was it. And I think, honestly, it was, as I loved The Hobbit, I loved The Lord of the Rings. I think it was really when I read The Lord of the Rings appendices that I just realized, wow.
That's
so
mind blown right there.
Yeah. So I guess I'm kind of, a little off topic because really I have to admit, I mean, The Hobbit pulled me into the world, but it was admittedly Lord of the Rings that kept me there,
Yeah, same here.
And I have to say, I mean, I reread Lord of the Rings every year since 1991, but I didn't always read The Hobbit. I will say that where I really rediscovered, or let me borrow Tolkien's word, recovered my love for The Hobbit was just a few years ago when my son was born.
Yeah.
So my son is 4 now. He was a really cranky newborn, and the only thing that would calm him down at night and that would actually get him to sleep was hearing me or my wife's voice. And we would sing, we would read baby books or whatever. And one night he was 3 months old, and I had probably been singing for hours. I was tired of singing David Bowie songs because he loved David Bowie when he was a baby.
That's hilarious. I think I would pay to hear audio of you singing David Bowie to your son, only because then I could humiliate you on Facebook.
Again, some things better left uncovered.
And
but
some things which were I can just hear Galadriel now.
Which should not have been. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, I just got tired of reading whatever baby books we were reading, singing whatever, and I just said, I'm going to read The Hobbit to him. And so I just picked up
Better
The
than
Hobbit.
War
and
and
just
Peace,
started,
right? I mean, it's,
right. So I just started reading that aloud to him, and
that's awesome.
And I just that's really what reawakened my wonder. I would say that really kind of allowed me to approach Middle Earth in a new way. Just seeing it, seeing it as a father. Was kind of the first new perspective in years, and that all started with The Hobbit. So, I don't know. Ever since then, I've had this newfound love for The Hobbit, and
that's cool.
I'm excited. I'm really excited about it.
I am too, because like you, The Lord of the Rings is what really draws me and keeps me. And then, like you, I read The Lord of the Rings every year. I mean, for goodness, probably from 82 when I was a freshman in high school, probably all the way until, I don't know, 97, 98. By that point, my wife and I had been married maybe 5-6 years. Mm-hmm. At that point, real life demands probably made it more like once every 2 years.
Yeah.
We read it out loud right before the movies came out, which was fantastic.
Oh, that's cool.
Because I was not going to let her watch the movies without reading the books first. And I still stand by that decision. But The Hobbit, I'm not going to say I lost the love for it, but it was replaced with this kind of greater love for The Lord of the Rings and then for the Silmarillion and all the depth that Middle-earth offers. But The Hobbit is really an amazing story on its own, and I am really looking forward to exploring that and to rediscovering that, not just for ourselves, but for our listeners, many of whom are also, very, quote-unquote hardcore and have kind of graduated and don't necessarily think of The Hobbit as much.
Yeah, forgotten the simple pleasures of The Hobbit,
Yeah. So speaking of that, how are we going to cover that here? How are we going to give it the Prancing Pony Podcast treatment? I'm sorry, I didn't prepare my effects today.
No worries.
But what are we going to do?
Well, so, I think a little explanation of what we're talking about here. So those of you who have read Corey Olsen's book, Exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, or who at least listened to our last episode in which we interviewed him, know that he kind of breaks out these 3 stages of The Hobbit's history. Mm-hmm. He describes it as the solo stage, which is basically, the original version, the original edition before Lord of the Rings came out. The revision stage, while it was being revised to add all this material for Lord of the Rings, and then the assimilation stage, which is where it's in now, basically fully absorbed into the mythology.
Yeah, as opposed to being fully absorbed into the Borg collective.
Right, yes, exactly. Right.
You will be assimilated.
What is it, resistance
Your
is
cultural,
futile?
resistance is futile.
Yeah.
Your biological and cultural distinctiveness anyway.
Will be absorbed into the legendary.
Yeah, I digress.
But, we thought about this quite a bit, and we have decided, although I think Corey Olsen actually makes a very good case for the solo stage.
He does.
A wonderful case for the solo stage. But we've actually decided that we're going to try and live... We're going to try and have it both ways, I guess. We're going to spend as much time on both the solo stage and the assimilation stage as possible, because it is interesting to see the work from both sides. But I think just, to kind of level set for everybody, I think we're going to be spending more time in the assimilation stage. I don't know why I feel like I can't say that word tonight. And I think that there are some good reasons for that.
There are.
Even though Corey Olsen makes a good case for focusing on the solo stage, and I think he does the right thing by doing so in his book. He does. Frankly, he does such a good job of it in his book that I don't really know what we could add to that.
Yeah,
I would just
that's
go
kind of
read
where
his
I'm
book,
at. I mean, I was so persuaded by Olsen's discussion on this topic before we talked about how we were going to handle this that I really thought we'd do what he did, and for the reasons he gives. But he's done it so well, we just end up looking like copycats. And I'm not. That's not where I want to go. But there's, one other pretty good reason.
Yeah, and I think that, I guess the obvious reason is, we started this podcast with the Silmarillion.
Yeah.
We've spent, 40 plus episodes on it. It would be silly, I think, for us to suddenly pretend like, we don't have all that earlier history of Middle-earth already. And I think that, that was kind of something we set out with the intention of from the beginning, really, wasn't it?
Because we're looking at the Legendarium as a whole. I mean, we started with the Silmarillion for a reason, and that reason is because we wanted to provide the backstory, the depth of backstory that was going to really enhance people's enjoyment of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. So kind of because of that, we really do have to go with the assimilation stage.
Yeah, I think so. So that's where we're going to be spending most of our time. We'll bring up the solo stage at times. I would say Corey Olsen's book, fantastic review of the solo stage.
Yes,
go read
definitely.
it. It's eye-opening.
It really is.
But we are going to spend a lot of time on the assimilation stage, and we are going to proceed with caution because, as Professor Olsen says, and we mentioned this in our Hobbit movie episode, we don't want to lose sight of the ideas that this story, that the Hobbit is interested in.
That's right.
We don't always want to be thinking of Frodo and Mount Doom, but but we want to also have that context.
Exactly, and we'll definitely point out where, you're going to be better off as listeners, kind of setting aside the Legendarium picture in order to better enjoy the narrower focus of the story that Tolkien wrote here.
Yeah, I think so. And, we probably will spend some time doing a little compare and contrast, just to kind of see what different patterns and what different readings and interpretations emerge by, especially something like Chapter 5 where it's so important.
Yeah, it's going to be huge there.
What picture of Gollum emerges from looking at the first edition text versus the later text? What might we have thought of Gollum if that was all we knew was the first edition?
Like, what if this podcast was happening in 1938?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that would be amazing for starters because
it would. Yeah. It would be really amazing.
I don't think smartphones were fast enough in 1938 to download episodes this long.
I can just see it now. It's coming across the telegraph line. That would take,
right. Yeah. Exactly.
How long would that take?
Yeah. So I think that's how we're planning to cover it, and follow along with us. Hopefully, you'll enjoy it. And I would say, in the words of Tolkien, now you know enough to go on with. But for more, I think you'll have to wait until next time. Indeed.
Well, that was a great discussion, Shawn. Folks, be sure to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll finally meet the first Hobbit here at the Prancing Pony. Now, before we wrap up with a question from Bartleman's Bag, if we've earned your support here at the Prancing Pony Podcast, you're going to want to take a look at our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/prancingponypod. We've set up some really cool goals, like a move to weekly episodes, which we're really close to, or at least as of this recording, and some really fun rewards, too.
Yes, definitely. And we do want to take a moment to thank those of you who've already joined the fellowship of the podcast by supporting us on Patreon. And we want to give a very special shout out to Maya from Michigan, who's our patron at the Kierdan's contribution tier. And if you would like a personalized shout out on our episodes, you know where to go.
Yep. And thank you, Maya. And for the rest of you, while your patronage is truly appreciated, we want to make something clear. We don't want you to feel obligated. This isn't a PBS drive, okay?
Right, absolutely not.
If you can afford it and if you think we've earned it, only then do we want you to consider signing up. Otherwise, just keep enjoying the podcast because we're going to keep enjoying making it.
That's right. Yep. And we will continue doing so.
Absolutely.
And we could also use a little help with something that, that will not cost you anything. We've got a survey from our podcast host that we could use some help with. It's a really short survey, 30 seconds if you take your time.
Yeah, seriously.
And it's basically helping us understand our audience a bit better. I promise we will stop mentioning this once we've gotten to the magic number of 250 completions that we need. Yeah. But until then, we are going to keep reminding folks of it. So please visit survey.libsyn, that's LIBSYN.com/The Prancing Pony Podcast, and help us out. We really appreciate it.
We do. And just a reminder that the demographic data is just collected in aggregate. We don't even see that. That goes straight to the podcast host so that they know whether you're a young audience or an old audience, a male audience, a female audience, etc.
Right.
Shawn and I are the only ones who get your email addresses. And once we get 250 completed surveys, we're going to do a drawing from all those email addresses. We're going to do 2 giveaways, a copy of the new Baird and Luthien book and a first edition facsimile edition of The Hobbit. We do want to express, though, that needs to be U.S. residents only just because of the cost of shipping. Check out our show notes for a link if you missed it. And Shawn, do we have any questions in Bartleman's bag this time around?
We certainly do. We got a question not long ago from one of our patrons, Frederick in Sweden. Frederick was thinking about one of our episodes a long, long time ago. This was episode 19, I believe, back when we talked about the origin of the sun and moon. We stuck mostly to the story in the Silmarillion in that discussion, but we also alluded briefly to the version of the story in History of Middle-earth, which Tolkien wrote later, which was a bit more kind of astronomically, astronomically sound and things like that, but also very philosophically different.
Very.
And again, if you want to hear what we said about that, go back to episode 19.
Wow, that's going way back. That's
very far back. And
let's go to the Wayback Machine.
Please, yeah, right. And please forgive how rough we must have sounded back in that episode. But
I think by then we'd caught our stride. It
probably so.
But not like it is now.
So. But we're getting better all the time, Alan.
And that's the hope.
I think.
That's the hope.
Anyway, Frederick, we kept you waiting long enough. Frederick wrote in saying about this episode, "This got me thinking. If we would make a timeline of all events in the Legendarium, what would we add to it? I think it's easy to come to the conclusion that Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, Children of Húrin, those are in the main timeline. But what about some of the stories that contradict these? Things like Tuor's coming to Gondolin, the story of Aldarion and Arendis, both of which are from the Unfinished Tales. Should these be considered as history in that same timeline, or should they be considered more like legends within the universe?"
Well, I'm not sure that those 2 stories that he gives the examples of are examples of stories that contradict the main timeline. So, I mean, that's going to kind of get us to where we're going. But, first off, by now, since the time when Frederick originally asked this, sorry, Frederick, you've waited a long time. We've kind of explained where we stand on some of these, but we want to recap and answer the question clearly. It's pretty clear that we both consider Tuor and his coming to Gondolin to be historical, not to be a legend, to be historical truth. And we treated it as that when we discussed Tuor's story back in episode 41.
Right.
I'd frankly say the same with Aldarion and Arendis, which I'm looking forward to when we get to that in Unfinished Tales in 5 years. And most of the rest of the stuff in Unfinished Tales about the Second Age. Celeborn and Galadriel is different.
That's a different one.
The challenge there is there are explicit contradictions. That's an example of a story that does contradict the main timeline.
Yeah.
And not only are there contradictions with the Legendarium as a whole, there are even some different contradictory alternatives within the tale itself. So you couldn't even accept all of that story as historical. You just have to understand that it's a process and that he was working through that to develop what the final version would be, and you have to just pick and choose.
Kind of pick and choose, yeah. Well, and then, in that's a perfect example, because in that Celeborn and Galadriel section is where you get things like the story of Mithrelus and Imrazor.
Oh, that's right.
Which, if you recall, I was pretty quick to write off as a legend.
Yeah, so was I.
But then, some of our listeners on Facebook actually pointed out, there's actually a passage in Lord of the Rings that suggests it probably is true.
Yeah.
And so, kind of looking at that again, I thought, well, yeah, actually, I think it's still intentionally a legend, but it's probably a true legend. I shouldn't have written it off quite so quickly. As for, if you look at something like History of Middle-earth, there's so much there. We tend to use the later books as references a lot just because they were written later, and they really do expand on the published Silmarillion. When you go back and look at the earlier books, especially the first 5, those preceded the published texts. They're largely earlier versions of the published stories that I would say generally we would say end up being replaced or superseded by the published texts. I mean, and I'm way oversimplifying this, but I mean the reality is it does kind of vary from piece to piece, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Generally where the incomplete material, the Unfinished Tales, for instance, where they're consistent with the completed material, we tend to think of it as being part of the historical truth.
Sure.
When it's contradictory, we generally don't. I mean, that's really the guideline. That's the measure. So the completed published material is the measure by which anything else can be defined, and that ends up being supreme. So if it contradicts, then no.
Then we go with the published, or the completed published material. Yeah.
But even that
the big
incomplete
five,
stuff,
you can say.
Exactly, the big five.
Or the big three, technically.
True. The incomplete material, though, can still be useful to help us understand what Tolkien was thinking. That's where I really find the value. You just have to be careful how you use it. I mean, I'm trying to think of an example. The Fall of Gondolin, let's say, in the Book of Lost Tales. That's a super complete version. It's a lot more complete than what we get in Unfinished Tales, and certainly
anything else, really.
The paragraph in the Silmarillion. So we want to use it because it's complete. But there are things in there like the mechanical beasts Milko used that were basically first-stage tanks and personnel carriers. They don't really fit with the later legendarium, so you have to be careful.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I would definitely say I agree with that. I mean, we just don't consider it history if the incomplete material is contradictory. I guess that's probably the quickest way to say it.
It really is.
But like you say, it does illuminate the published version. I think another good example of that is some of the stuff we brought in from the Lay of Lathian in our Baron and Luthien episodes. Some of that is a little contradictory. Some of that is just a little bit different version. But man, you get some really good details there. And if you kind of pick and choose which parts you want to take, I think you really enrich the story.
Yeah, you do.
It's interesting to consider whether if Tolkien had more time, all the time in the world to work on these things, if he would have worked in some of these early versions as let's say in-universe legends. He talked in some of his letters, and I think in Morgoth's Ring, about how some of these stories from the Silmarillion are Mannish versions of Elvish originals, and that some of them did get corrupted over time. And I wonder, I would love to think that, maybe somewhere we could have gotten, something kind of like we got with The Hobbit Chapter 5, oh, this other version was just a lie to cover up the truth, or this other version was just a mistranslation, I would love to imagine that. It's great to think of a world where we could read the Book of Lost Tales or read about, Tevildo, Prince of Cats, and think of that as a mistranslation of, of the real story.
That would be nice.
That's, that you can only really take that so far. That's not what we ended up with. It would have been great if we did, but unfortunately it's, we've got the text we've got.
That's true. Well, Frederick, that was a great question. Thank you for sending that in. Folks, that wraps it up for another episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast, the first episode of our second season. As always, thank you very much for joining us. Be sure to join us again in 2 weeks when we finally get to the first chapter of the book that started it all, The Hobbit.
It is really hard to believe we're already here, and at the same time, it feels like it's taken forever to get here. But yes, the wait is over. An unexpected party begins in our next episode.
Spoilers? Well, all right. I guess it's not really unexpected anymore, is it?
No, that's true. But I guess a long expected party doesn't really work for this book.
No, true. Folks, we really want to encourage you all to read along and take notes in your own copy of The Hobbit, so check out the official library tab on our website, theprancingponypodcast.com. Sean's worked really hard to update the page, and we've got links to inexpensive paperbacks as well as the good stuff for your Tolkien collection.
And don't forget, today is the last day to get in on the first batch of custom-made Prancing Pony Podcast t-shirts.
That's right.
So be sure to check out our social media if you want one. And also, if you wouldn't mind heading over to iTunes for us and leaving a review, we'd certainly be grateful for that.
We would.
As we've said many times before, those reviews help us get more visibility in iTunes, and that just translates to a bigger and a more vibrant Tolkien community.
Absolutely. And make sure you never miss an episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast by subscribing to our podcast through iTunes or your favorite podcast app. You can find us in most any podcast directory, or if you like your podcast the old-fashioned way, the RSS feed is on our website.
And we want to thank all of you who have become part of our social media family. We set out to start a Tolkien conversation that everyone could join, which is why we have our online common room on the Facebook at The Prancing Pony Podcast and on Twitter at Prancing Pony Podcast.
Did you just say on the Facebook?
Did I? Probably.
20 years older than you are.
Probably. It's on the Facebook. We're on the Facebook.
We're on the Facebook.
Whatever.
One last thing as always, folks. Don't forget to send your questions, comments, or invitations to tea with seed cakes, if you have any, to Barliman at theprancingponypodcast.com. Now, that's a new email address, so be sure to jot it down, Barliman at theprancingponypodcast.com, and we'll try to get them into our next episode. Well, an hour 45 is still far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners. But until next time.
Farewell, friends.